I have to admit that by the time we got to the end of part three of understanding the gospel, it really wasn't all that encouraging. We saw that God and the humanity he created, the humanity that he loves, is separated from him by a huge gap. In part one, we saw that while God at his very core is a God of love, loving every single person on the planet, he's also a holy God, a perfect God, who is perfectly pure with no tolerance for any evil or any wrongdoing. He's perfectly righteous with a perfect standard of right and wrong that he'll never deviate from. And he's perfectly just without any favoritism or partiality. Then in part two, we saw that humanity really doesn't care much about what God thinks, just wants to go its own way, being unloving, impure, unrighteous, and unjust. It wants to live independent of his authority, rebel, and create its own rules and values. This attitude of being independent and rebellious against God is what the Bible calls sin. And sin has a huge consequence, a huge penalty. And that penalty is not getting slapped on the hand or having to pay a fine or having to do some good things to kind of balance out the scale. The Bible says the penalty, the consequence for sin is death, being separated from the life of God today, tomorrow, and forever. And as we got to the end of part three, we saw there's nothing we can do to save ourselves and fix this problem. The solution is found in a person, the person of Jesus Christ. Now, you may think, why Jesus? Why not Muhammad, or why not the Dalai Lama, or why not someone else? Jesus is the only answer for two reasons. First, because of who he is, and second, because of what he did. Let's start with who he is. Jesus is not just some prophet or just some teacher, just some good guy. He is God. He is the creator of the world and all that's in it. He is God in human skin. He claimed this again and again, and the people understood what he was saying. In fact, at his trial, the only thing they could really pin on him was that he was a blasphemer because he, being human, was claiming to be God. Yeah, they got it. He also lived a perfectly sinless life. He was around people for 33 years and no one could ever point out anything he'd ever done wrong, which is why at his trial they had to go with the blasphemy thing. He also did miracles, and we're not talking rabbit out of the hat kind of tricks, but real honest to goodness miracles. Coming upon a funeral and raising a child to life right out of the coffin. People born blind getting their sight back. Thousands being fed from a kid's sack lunch. But the biggest miracle of all was his resurrection, something he had said was going to happen. His execution was very public. His burial was very public. And the tomb being empty on the third day was also very public. He spent nearly 7 weeks around the city of Jerusalem in Israel after his resurrection, and hundreds upon hundreds saw him and interacted with him. There is no question he'd come back to life, especially in the first century, because there were way too many eyewitnesses. But while it's nice that God came to earth and visited the planet that he'd created, remember there's a huge problem called sin that stands between God and the people that he loves. And the penalty for that sin is death, a separation from God both now and forever. And as we saw earlier, there's not a single thing we can do to fix the problem. It's just way above our pay grade. What Jesus did is that he stepped in and died to pay the penalty for our sin. He took the hit for us. And the only reason he could do that is because he had no sin of his own. If he'd just been another human or a prophet like Muhammad or the Dalai Lama, he couldn't help us because he'd have to die for his own sin. But because he was perfect, because he was sinless, he could do what no one else could do. He could be our substitute. It should have been us, you and me on that cross, but he took our place. This is what the Old Testament prophet says in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 53, verses 5 and 6. Let's read it. He, speaking of Jesus, was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities, our wrongdoing. The chastening of our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging or by his wounds we're healed. Verse 6. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. That's what we said sin is, just doing our own thing, turning our back on God. But the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. He took the hit for us. This is what the Apostle Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3. And let me read it. 1 chapter 3 and verse 18. He says, for Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, the righteous for the unrighteous, the pure for the impure, that he might bring us to God. That's what Jesus did for us. He took the hit for us. See, the solution to any problem has to be equal to the size of the problem. If I owe $1,000 and I pay $10, I say, we good? That wouldn't meet the need because the problem is so much bigger. God being both 100% loving and 100% holy at the same time creates a huge problem because it's hard to be both at the same time. Love would say, it's okay, just forget it. But holiness requires that every last bit of justice be satisfied. The key to everything is that what Jesus did at the cross satisfied both love and holiness, both love and justice, both love and righteousness. In his holiness, he didn't overlook sin, but he made sure the demands of justice were met, death. But in his love, he didn't want you and me to have to pay for it, so he did it for us, death on the cross. This means he can now offer us forgiveness and a forever relationship with him as a free gift. It's already been paid for. No more earn and owe. It's free, which is the really good news about the solution being Jesus. But even after all that, there's one more thing we have to look at when it comes to understanding the gospel. There has to be a response. And that's what we're going to look at in part 5.